July 15, 1943. Deep in the steaming jungles of New Guinea, a Japanese patrol stumbled upon something that would change everything they thought they knew about the war. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka pushed through the thick vegetation, following reports from local scouts about an aircraft crash site 3 kilometers inland from their coastal position. His unit had been searching for 2 days, guided only by the vague descriptions of villagers who spoke of a strange twin-tailed plane that had fallen from the sky during a recent engagement. When they finally broke through the dense canopy into a small clearing, Tanaka stopped so abruptly that the soldier behind him nearly collided with his back. There, resting at an awkward angle with one wing buried in the mud, was an aircraft unlike anything he had seen in his 4 years of military service. The twin booms, extending back from the central fuselage, gave it an otherworldly appearance, and even damaged and covered in jungle grime. It radiated a sense of technological sophistication that made his stomach tighten with unease. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning had been one of the most feared American fighters in the Pacific theater, but most Japanese pilots only saw them as fleeting silhouettes during combat or as wreckage too destroyed to examine. This one, however, was remarkably intact. The cockpit canopy was shattered and one propeller blade bent, but the twin Allison engines appeared undamaged. The pilot had clearly managed some form of controlled crash landing before abandoning the aircraft, probably picked up by American search and rescue before Japanese forces could reach the area. Tanaka circled the machine slowly, his engineering background from Tokyo University making him acutely aware that he was looking at something significant. The smooth aluminum skin seemed impossibly thin compared to Japanese aircraft, yet intelligence reports indicated these planes could take tremendous punishment. The twin-boom design puzzled him. It seemed wasteful, over-engineered, yet it must serve some purpose that Japanese designers had not considered necessary or feasible. He ordered his men to establish a defensive perimeter while he examined the cockpit more closely. The instrument panel, though partially damaged, revealed a complexity that troubled him deeply. Dozens of gauges and controls, all labeled in English, suggested a level of sophistication in pilot support systems that Japanese fighters simply did not possess. The seat itself was heavily armored, another luxury that Japanese military philosophy dismissed as unnecessary weight that reduced performance. But it was when Tanaka climbed onto the wing and peered into the ammunition bays that his heart truly sank. The aircraft carried 4 50 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon, all grouped in the nose for concentrated firepower. Japanese fighters scattered their weapons across the wings, reducing accuracy. This design, this entire machine, represented a different philosophy of warfare. One that prioritized pilot survival and technological advantage over the spiritual determination that Japanese training emphasized. As evening approached, Tanaka sent an urgent coded message back to his headquarters. He had found something that his superiors needed to see, something that might change their understanding of what they were truly fighting against. The message from Lieutenant Tanaka's jungle outpost reached Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters in Tokyo 3 days later, passing through multiple layers of command before landing on the desk of Captain Minoru Genda at the Naval Air Arsenal in Yokosuka. Genda read the report twice, his expression growing more intent with each pass. An intact P-38 Lightning represented an intelligence opportunity that Japan desperately needed as the tide of the Pacific War shifted inexorably against them. Within hours, Genda had assembled a briefing for Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, who oversaw naval aviation development. The meeting took place in a cramped office overlooking Tokyo Bay, where the admiral listened without interruption as Genda outlined the significance of the discovery. The P-38 had been a persistent problem for Japanese forces, consistently outperforming their best fighters in speed, altitude, and firepower. Understanding its capabilities could provide crucial insights for improving Japanese aircraft design. Admiral Ozawa nodded slowly, his weathered face betraying nothing of his thoughts. He had seen too many promising developments fail to materialize into battlefield advantages. Still, this opportunity seemed too valuable to ignore. He authorized an immediate recovery operation, assigning substantial resources to extract the aircraft from New Guinea and transport it back to Japan for comprehensive evaluation. The mission would be dangerous, requiring coordination between Army and Navy units in a region where American air superiority grew stronger each week. Genda was given 48 hours to assemble a technical team capable of disassembling, transporting, and reassembling the Lightning. He chose carefully, selecting engineers who had studied American design philosophy and understood English technical documentation. The team would need to work quickly in hostile territory, breaking down the aircraft into components small enough to transport by truck through the jungle to the nearest airfield, then loading everything onto transport planes for the journey back to Japan. The man chosen to lead the recovery operation was Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto, a 32-year-old naval aviator whose engineering degree from Osaka University made him uniquely qualified for the technical challenges ahead. Yamamoto received his orders during a quiet evening at the Yokosuka base where he had been overseeing routine maintenance operations. When Genda explained the mission, Yamamoto felt both excitement and a growing sense of foreboding that he could not quite articulate. That night, Yamamoto studied everything available about the P-38 Lightning. American propaganda photographs, combat reports from Japanese pilots, intelligence summaries compiled from various sources. Each piece of information added to a picture that disturbed him. The aircraft represented a level of industrial capability and design sophistication that suggested America possessed resources far beyond what Japanese propaganda claimed. If one fighter could embody such technological advancement, what did that imply about American production capacity across their entire military? He pushed the thought aside and focused on the practical challenges ahead. Within 36 hours, his team of 12 engineers and 20 support personnel would depart for New Guinea. They had 2 weeks to recover the Lightning and return it to Japan. Failure was not an option. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto's team landed at WWII Airfield on the northern coast of New Guinea on July 23, 1943. The oppressive heat hit them like a physical blow as they descended from the transport aircraft, and within minutes their uniforms were soaked with sweat. The base commander, a weary army colonel named Ishida, greeted them with barely concealed skepticism about their mission's chances of success. The jungle between WWII and the crash site was controlled by neither side, a no-man's land where Japanese and Allied patrols clashed regularly. American aircraft dominated the skies during daylight hours, making any movement extremely dangerous. Ishida assigned 30 combat troops to escort Yamamoto's team, warning that they might encounter Australian ground forces or local resistance fighters who had grown increasingly bold in recent months. They departed before dawn the next morning, trucks loaded with cutting equipment, winches, and carefully packed crates for transporting aircraft components. Lieutenant Tanaka, who had discovered the Lightning, served as their guide through trails that barely deserved the name. Progress was agonizingly slow as they hacked through vegetation that seemed to grow back as quickly as they cut it away. Yamamoto rode in the lead truck, studying technical diagrams of the P-38 structure that American manuals had provided through captured documents. He mentally rehearsed the disassembly sequence, knowing they would have at most 3 days at the site before enemy patrols or air reconnaissance discovered their presence. Every component had to be carefully documented, labeled, and packed to ensure successful reassembly in Japan. They reached the crash site on the afternoon of the second day. Yamamoto's first close look at the Lightning confirmed what he had suspected from photographs. This was not simply a faster or more powerful version of existing designs, but rather a fundamental rethinking of what a fighter aircraft could be. The twin-boom configuration, while unusual, provided exceptional stability and allowed the concentration of all armament in the nose. Japanese designers had dismissed such layouts as unnecessarily complex, yet here was proof that complexity could yield significant tactical advantages. His team worked through the night under carefully shielded lights, beginning the methodical process of disassembly. Each panel removed revealed more sophisticated engineering. The hydraulic systems were elegant in their simplicity and reliability. The electrical wiring showed a level of organization and redundancy that Japanese aircraft rarely incorporated. Even the fasteners and joints demonstrated manufacturing precision that spoke to industrial capabilities his country could not match. By the third day, they had reduced the Lightning to manageable components, each carefully wrapped and crated. The escort troops maintained nervous vigilance as American aircraft could be heard in the distance. When the last crate was loaded onto the trucks, Yamamoto took one final look at the clearing where the Lightning had rested. They had captured an enemy aircraft, but he suspected they had also captured evidence of an uncomfortable truth about the war's likely outcome. The convoy began its dangerous journey back to WWII. The P-38 Lightning arrived at Yokosuka Naval Air Arsenal on August 7, 1943, transported in wooden crates that bore no markings indicating their precious contents. Captain Genda had cleared an entire hangar for the reassembly operation, restricting access to only those personnel with the highest security clearance. Word spread quickly through the base despite these precautions, and engineers found excuses to walk past the sealed hangar, curious about what treasure lay inside. Yamamoto supervised the unpacking with meticulous care, each component emerging from its protective wrapping like an artifact from an alien civilization. His team worked in shifts around the clock, cross-referencing American technical manuals that intelligence had acquired through various channels. The reassembly process took 9 days, slowed by the need to understand each system thoroughly rather than simply bolting parts together. This was not merely reconstruction but an education in American aviation philosophy. Chief Engineer Koji Tanaka, a veteran of Japanese aircraft design who had worked on the Zero fighter program, spent hours examining the Lightning's Allison engines. He called Yamamoto over on the 4th day of reassembly, his voice tight with barely suppressed emotion. These engines produced 1,475 horsepower each, he explained, pointing to specifications stamped on various components. Japanese factories were still struggling to produce reliable engines exceeding 1,000 horsepower. The Americans had not only solved the engineering challenges, but had done so with an eye toward mass production, using modular components that could be quickly replaced in field conditions. The aircraft's turbochargers particularly fascinated the engineering team. These devices allowed the Lightning to maintain engine power at altitudes where Japanese fighters struggled to operate effectively. The supercharger technology represented years of metallurgical and engineering development that Japan had not prioritized, assuming that aerial combat would occur at lower altitudes where maneuverability mattered more than raw power. The Americans had simply refused to accept such limitations. When the reassembly neared completion, Yamamoto invited Captain Genda to inspect their work. The captain walked around the reconstructed Lightning in silence, occasionally reaching out to touch the aluminum skin or peer into access panels. Finally, he stopped beside the cockpit and looked at Yamamoto with an expression that mixed admiration with something darker, perhaps fear. "This changes our understanding of the war," Genda said quietly, ensuring no one else could hear. Intelligence reports about American industrial capacity had seemed exaggerated, the product of enemy propaganda designed to demoralize Japanese forces. But this aircraft proved those reports were, if anything, understated. The Lightning was not a prototype or experimental design, but a production aircraft, one of thousands rolling off American assembly lines. Every component showed the marks of mass manufacturing, suggesting that America could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. Yamamoto nodded, having reached the same conclusion during his weeks working with the captured fighter. They had set out to understand an enemy weapon and had instead discovered evidence of an enemy capability that rendered Japanese victory mathematically impossible. The question of who would fly the captured Lightning created unexpected controversy at Yokosuka. Captain Genda required a pilot with exceptional skill, someone capable of pushing the aircraft to its limits while providing detailed technical feedback. More importantly, he needed someone whose loyalty and discretion were beyond question, as the test flights would reveal information that contradicted official narratives about Japanese air superiority. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai arrived at the arsenal on August 20, 1943, still recovering from injuries sustained during combat over Guadalcanal the previous year. Shrapnel had damaged his left eye, ending his days as a frontline fighter pilot, but not his value to the Imperial Navy. At 29 years old, he had achieved 64 confirmed aerial victories, making him one of Japan's most experienced and respected combat aviators. Genda met Sakai in his office, explaining the assignment with characteristic bluntness. They needed someone who understood air combat intimately, who could evaluate the Lightning not as an engineer but as a warrior who had faced similar aircraft in battle. Sakai listened without interruption, his damaged eye covered by a leather patch that gave him a perpetually intense expression. When Genda finished, Sakai asked only one question. Would he be required to lie about what he discovered? The captain paused, considering his response carefully. "You will be required to report honestly to myself and Admiral Ozawa," he said finally. "What happens to that information afterward is not our decision to make." Sakai nodded slowly, understanding the implicit message. They were serving a military leadership that had grown increasingly divorced from battlefield realities, more concerned with maintaining morale than confronting uncomfortable truths. Yamamoto spent the next 3 days briefing Sakai on the Lightning's systems and characteristics. The pilot proved to be a quick study, his combat experience allowing him to immediately grasp the tactical implications of various design features. When Yamamoto explained the concentrated nose armament, Sakai's expression darkened. Japanese fighters required pilots to calculate convergence, distances where wing-mounted guns focused their fire. The Lightning eliminated that complexity entirely, making aerial gunnery significantly easier for less experienced pilots. The cockpit layout fascinated and troubled Sakai in equal measure. American designers had clearly prioritized pilot comfort and situational awareness over weight savings. The seat was heavily armored, the canopy provided exceptional visibility, and the instrument panel was logically organized. Japanese training emphasized spiritual fortitude over physical comfort, but Sakai recognized that exhausted, comfortable pilots made better decisions than exhausted, miserable ones during extended missions. On the evening before his first test flight, Sakai walked around the Lightning alone in the hangar. He touched the polished aluminum skin, examined the massive propellers, and stood beneath the twin booms that gave the aircraft its distinctive silhouette. This machine represented everything Japanese military philosophy claimed did not matter: technological superiority, industrial capacity, pilot protection. Yet he had seen these aircraft dominate the skies over the Pacific, shooting down Japanese fighters with disturbing regularity. Dawn broke clear over Yokosuka on August 24, 1943, as Lieutenant Sakai climbed into the P-38 Lightning's cockpit for the first time as a pilot rather than an observer. Ground crew had spent the previous day conducting engine tests and systems checks, confirming that the reassembled aircraft was airworthy. Captain Genda watched from the hangar entrance, flanked by Yamamoto and a small group of senior engineers who understood the significance of this moment. Sakai settled into the seat, immediately noticing how the armor plating cradled his back and shoulders. Japanese fighters saved weight by sacrificing pilot protection, a decision that made philosophical sense until you watched friends die from wounds that better armor might have prevented. The Americans had chosen differently, accepting reduced performance in exchange for keeping experienced pilots alive. He wondered which approach would prove wiser in a long war. The twin Allison engines roared to life with a deep, powerful sound that Japanese radial engines never quite matched. Sakai felt the vibration through the control column as he advanced the throttles, testing response and noting the smooth progression of power. Everything felt solid, overbuilt, engineered with redundancy that Japanese designs could not afford. He released the brakes and began his taxi to the runway. The Lightning's tricycle landing gear making ground handling remarkably easy compared to the tail draggers he had flown throughout his career. Takeoff required less runway than he expected. The powerful engines and efficient propellers pulled the Lightning into the air with an authority that left him momentarily breathless. He raised the landing gear and felt the aircraft accelerate as drag decreased. Within minutes, He had climbed to 3,000 meters, an altitude that would have taken significantly longer in a Zero fighter. The rate of climb was simply extraordinary. Sakai began a series of basic maneuvers, testing the Lightning's handling characteristics. The controls felt heavy compared to Japanese fighters, requiring more physical effort to initiate turns and rolls. But once established in a maneuver, the aircraft held its attitude with rock-solid stability. Japanese fighters were nimble, responsive, perfect for the kind of turning dogfights that emphasized pilot skill. The Lightning was designed for a different kind of combat, diving attacks that exploited superior speed and climb rate, maintaining energy advantage rather than getting drawn into prolonged engagements. He pushed the throttles forward and entered a steep dive, watching the airspeed indicator climb past speeds that would have torn apart any Japanese fighter he had flown. The Lightning remained perfectly controllable, its heavy structure and sophisticated design absorbing stresses that lighter aircraft could not endure. When he pulled out of the dive and climbed again, the engines maintained full power without the overheating problems that plagued Japanese designs during sustained high-power operations. After 40 minutes, Sakai returned to Yokosuka and landed, taxiing back to the hangar where Genda waited. As ground crew rushed forward to secure the aircraft, Sakai remained in the cockpit for a long moment, his mind racing through implications he was not sure he wanted to acknowledge. Captain Genda convened a restricted briefing 3 days after Sakai completed his initial test flights. The meeting took place in a secure room deep within the Yokosuka complex, attended only by Admiral Ozawa, Yamamoto, Chief Engineer Tanaka, and Sakai himself. 2 armed guards stood outside the sealed doors, ensuring no unauthorized personnel could overhear what was about to be discussed. Sakai delivered his assessment, standing before a chalkboard where he had sketched performance comparisons. His voice remained steady and professional as he methodically destroyed every comforting assumption Japanese military leadership had made about their aircraft superiority. The Lightning was faster than any Japanese fighter by at least 80 kilometers per hour. It could outclimb them by nearly double. It could outdive them by margins that made pursuit impossible. And it possessed firepower that could destroy Japanese aircraft with brief bursts from ranges where return fire was ineffective. The only advantage Japanese fighters retained was maneuverability at lower speeds, the ability to turn inside the Lightning's wider radius. But Sakai explained with brutal honesty that this advantage was meaningless if American pilots refused to engage in turning fights. The Lightning's performance allowed its pilots to choose when and how to fight, dictating engagement terms that negated Japanese tactical strengths. American doctrine emphasized energy fighting, maintaining speed and altitude advantage, striking quickly and disengaging before Japanese fighters could respond. Chief Engineer Tanaka followed with his technical analysis, and if Sakai's report was sobering, Tanaka's was devastating. He presented detailed comparisons of manufacturing techniques, material science, and production methodologies evident in the Lightning's construction. Every component revealed industrial capabilities that Japan could not match. The aluminum alloys were stronger and lighter than Japanese equivalents. The manufacturing tolerances were tighter, indicating precision tooling that Japanese factories lacked. Even the paint and protective coatings were superior, suggesting advances in chemistry and metallurgy across multiple industries. But Tanaka's most damning observation concerned not the aircraft itself, but what it implied about American production capacity. The Lightning was not crude or improvised, but rather showed every sign of mature mass production. Modular components, interchangeable parts, design features that simplified assembly and maintenance. The Americans were building these aircraft by the hundreds, perhaps thousands, while Japan struggled to produce fighters using labor-intensive methods that could never achieve similar output. Admiral Ozawa sat motionless throughout both presentations, his expression carved from stone. When the briefings concluded, he asked only one question. Could Japanese industry replicate the Lightning's capabilities if given complete technical documentation and unlimited resources? Tanaka hesitated before answering honestly. Even with perfect knowledge and infinite budget, Japan lacked the industrial infrastructure, the skilled workforce, the raw materials, and most critically, the time to close the technological gap. The room fell silent as the implications settled over them like a funeral shroud. They had captured an enemy fighter, hoping to find exploitable weaknesses. Instead, they had discovered irrefutable evidence that Japan was fighting an opponent whose industrial and technological superiority made eventual defeat inevitable. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto received new orders from Captain Genda on September 3, 1943. The Lightning's technical evaluation had raised questions that extended beyond aircraft design into broader strategic concerns. Genda wanted comprehensive intelligence analysis of American industrial capacity, correlating what they had learned from the captured fighter with information from other sources. Yamamoto was given access to classified intelligence reports that normally remained restricted to only the highest levels of naval command. What he discovered over the following weeks left him shaken in ways that combat never had. Intelligence summaries compiled from neutral observers, intercepted communications, and reconnaissance photographs painted a picture of American industrial mobilization that seemed almost impossible. The United States was producing aircraft at rates that Japanese analysts had initially dismissed as enemy propaganda. But the evidence was overwhelming and internally consistent across multiple independent sources. American factories were manufacturing approximately 8,000 aircraft per month by mid-1943. Japan's entire aircraft industry, working at maximum capacity, produced roughly 2,000 aircraft monthly. The disparity was not merely quantitative but qualitative. American production lines employed assembly techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing, allowing semi-skilled workers to build complex aircraft with remarkable speed and consistency. Japanese production relied heavily on skilled craftsmen, a method that produced excellent individual aircraft but could never achieve mass production efficiency. Yamamoto compiled data on specific American aircraft types, and the numbers grew, more disturbing with each page. The P-38 Lightning that they had studied so carefully was only one of several advanced fighter designs in mass production. Americans were simultaneously building P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, and F-6F Hellcats, each representing different design philosophies, but all sharing the same characteristics of robust construction, powerful engines, and heavy armament. Japan was attempting to compete with multiple aircraft types while America deployed an entire ecosystem of complementary designs. But aircraft production represented only part of the equation. Yamamoto discovered intelligence reports detailing American shipbuilding capacity that made Japanese naval construction seem almost medieval by comparison. The Americans had developed techniques for welding ship hulls rather than riveting them, cutting construction time dramatically. They were launching escort carriers, destroyers, and cargo vessels at rates measured in days and weeks rather than months and years. The industrial base that could produce such numbers was fundamentally different from anything Japan possessed. Raw material access provided another crushing disparity. American steel production exceeded Japanese output by factors of 10 or more. Aluminum production showed similar ratios. Oil, rubber, copper, and virtually every strategic material existed in American abundance, while Japan scraped together resources from conquered territories and strained supply lines. The P-38's construction had required aluminum quantities that would have built 3 or 4 Japanese fighters, yet Americans could afford such material expenditure because they possessed reserves that Japan could only imagine. Yamamoto worked late into the night completing his analysis, knowing that the conclusions were inescapable. Japan was not merely losing the production race, but had never been in it to begin with. Admiral Ozawa called an emergency conference on September 18, 1943, at a private residence outside Tokyo that naval intelligence used for discussions too sensitive for official headquarters. The location choice itself signaled the meeting's extraordinary nature. 6 senior officers attended, including Captain Genda, Rear Admiral Takejiro Onishi, and several department heads from naval aviation and strategic planning. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto was the most junior officer present, included only because his research had prompted the gathering. The men arrived separately throughout the evening, avoiding any appearance of coordination. Once assembled in a room swept for listening devices, Ozawa dispensed with formal protocols and spoke with uncharacteristic bluntness. They needed to discuss facts that contradicted official policy, facts that could be considered defeatist or even treasonous if spoken in wrong company. But as officers responsible for naval aviation's future, they had a duty to confront reality regardless of how uncomfortable it made them. Yamamoto presented his industrial analysis first, laying out the production numbers and material disparities with careful documentation. He had anticipated skepticism and brought multiple independent sources confirming each major point. The officers listened in heavy silence as he demonstrated that American industrial capacity exceeded Japanese capabilities by margins that made the war's outcome a matter of mathematics rather than willpower or tactical brilliance. Captain Genda followed with the Lightning's technical evaluation, using Sakai's flight reports and engineering assessments to illustrate how far Japanese aircraft design had fallen behind American developments. He emphasized that the P-38 was not an experimental prototype but a mature production aircraft, one of several advanced designs that Americans were building in quantities that Japan could never match. The technological gap was widening, not closing, as American industry accelerated while Japanese production strained under resource shortages and Allied bombing. Rear Admiral Onishi, known for his aggressive advocacy of offensive operations, asked the question that everyone was thinking but no one wanted to voice. Could Japan still win this war? The room fell silent. Yamamoto glanced at Genda, who nodded slightly, granting permission to speak freely. Yamamoto took a breath and delivered the conclusion his research had forced upon him. Japan could not win a prolonged war of attrition against American industrial capacity. Victory required forcing a negotiated peace before American production superiority became overwhelming. But Onishi pressed further, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. Was such a peace still possible given current circumstances? The Guadalcanal campaign had ended in Japanese withdrawal. The Aleutians had been retaken by American forces. Allied advances in New Guinea continued despite fierce resistance. Yamamoto hesitated, aware that his answer might constitute sedition under military law. He chose his words carefully, stating only that the window for favorable negotiation was closing rapidly, if it had not already closed. Admiral Ozawa sat back, his face unreadable in the dim light. The intelligence they possessed, the understanding they had gained from studying the captured Lightning, placed them in an impossible position. They knew truths that contradicted official policy but lacked authority to act on that knowledge. The weeks following the secret meeting created a strange tension at Yokosuka Naval Air Arsenal. Officers who had attended now possessed knowledge that colored every decision, every briefing, every interaction with personnel who still believed official narratives about inevitable Japanese victory. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto found himself increasingly isolated, unable to share his concerns with most colleagues, yet unable to ignore the implications of what he had learned. He began meeting informally with other junior officers who had worked on the Lightning evaluation, careful conversations in quiet corners where they could speak without being overheard. Lieutenant Sakai joined these discussions when his duties permitted, bringing the perspective of a combat veteran who had seen the war's trajectory firsthand. These younger officers represented a generation that had grown up with military indoctrination but possessed enough technical education to recognize when ideology conflicted with physical reality. Chief Engineer Tanaka became an unlikely mentor to this informal group, sharing observations from his years in aircraft design that illuminated how Japanese military culture had created its own defeat. The emphasis on spiritual superiority over material advantage, the rejection of pilot protection as weakness, the insistence that Japanese craftsmanship was inherently superior to mass production. All these beliefs had seemed noble and patriotic, but the Lightning proved them to be fatal delusions. One evening in late September, 6 officers gathered in Tanaka's small apartment near the arsenal. They spoke in hushed voices despite being in a private residence, aware that military police had grown increasingly aggressive about investigating defeatist talk. Yamamoto shared disturbing news from his intelligence sources. The naval air groups that had fought so brilliantly in the war's early months had been decimated, their experienced pilots killed faster than training programs could replace them. Meanwhile, American pilot training had expanded enormously, producing aviators who might lack individual brilliance but flew aircraft so superior that skill gaps mattered less. Lieutenant Kobayashi, a young engineer who had worked on the Lightning's engine analysis, posed a question that verged on treason. Should they not inform someone with authority to act on this information, perhaps someone in the civilian government who might pursue peace negotiations? The suggestion hung in the air like poison gas. They all knew that such action would likely result in arrest, court-martial, and execution. The military leadership had grown increasingly intolerant of anyone questioning the path toward final victory. Sakai spoke quietly, his single eye reflecting lamplight as he described watching friends die in aircraft that could not compete with American fighters. He had survived by skill and luck, but he recognized that individual heroism could not overcome systemic disadvantages. Japanese pilots were being asked to compensate for industrial and technological failures through sacrifice and determination, an equation that could only end one way. They concluded the meeting without reaching any decision about action, but they had at least spoken truths to each other that they could share with no one else. They were officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy who no longer believed their nation could win the war they were fighting. On October 5, 1943, Captain Genda received orders that made him physically ill. Imperial General Headquarters wanted a public report on the captured P-38 Lightning, emphasizing Japanese technical superiority and downplaying any advantages the American aircraft might possess. The propaganda department had learned about the Lightning's evaluation and saw an opportunity to boost public morale with stories of Japanese engineers mastering enemy technology. Genda met with Admiral Ozawa to discuss their response, knowing they faced an impossible situation. They could not refuse a direct order from General Headquarters, yet they could not honestly claim Japanese superiority after everything their evaluation had revealed. Ozawa made the decision with characteristic pragmatism. They would provide a report that was technically accurate but carefully selective in what it emphasized, a masterwork of misdirection that told no outright lies while supporting the narrative that leadership demanded. The resulting document praised Japanese engineers for successfully reassembling and flying the captured aircraft, portrayed as a significant intelligence achievement. It noted the P-38's heavy construction as a weakness that reduced maneuverability, technically true, but deliberately ignoring that the weight provided pilot protection and structural strength for high-speed combat. It mentioned the Lightning's complexity as a maintenance liability, again factual but omitting that American logistics could support such complexity while Japanese supply lines were collapsing. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto was assigned to draft sections of the report, a task that required him to weaponize truth through selective presentation. He wrote about the Lightning's twin-boom design as inefficient, emphasizing the additional drag and weight without discussing the tactical advantages it provided. He described the concentrated nose armament as a limited design choice rather than the revolutionary improvement it represented for aerial gunnery. Every sentence was factually defensible, yet fundamentally dishonest. The propaganda version of the Lightning evaluation appeared in military newspapers and radio broadcasts throughout October. Japanese citizens heard about brave engineers who had captured enemy technology and demonstrated its inferiority to Japanese designs. Pilots at forward bases received briefings assuring them that the P-38, while formidable, possessed exploitable weaknesses that Japanese fighters could overcome through superior tactics and pilot skill. None of them learned about the industrial capacity analysis, the production comparisons, or the honest assessments that made victory seem mathematically impossible. Sakai found the propaganda particularly galling. He was occasionally asked to speak with pilot trainees about his experience flying the Lightning, always with political officers present to ensure he emphasized approved talking points. He spoke about the aircraft's heavy controls and wide turning radius, while remaining silent about its overwhelming advantages in speed, climb rate, and firepower. The young pilots listened eagerly, their faces showing relief at being told that Japanese spirit could overcome American material advantages. Sakai saw his younger self in their expressions and felt ashamed. The propaganda machine had taken their honest technical evaluation and transformed it into another weapon for prolonging a war that Japan could not win. Yamamoto, Genda, Sakai, and the others who knew the truth were complicit in this deception, unable to speak openly without destroying themselves. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai stood in the hangar long after the other personnel had departed for the evening, staring at the P-38 Lightning that had become both his assignment and his torment. November winds rattled the hangar doors as he walked slowly around the aircraft, remembering the propaganda briefing he had delivered that afternoon to 40 young pilots fresh from training. Their eager faces had looked at him with reverence, believing every carefully constructed half-truth he had been ordered to tell them. He had described the Lightning's weaknesses accurately enough. The heavy controls, the wide turning radius, the complexity that could create maintenance challenges under field conditions. All true. But he had omitted the crushing realities that would get those young pilots killed. He had not mentioned that the Lightning could choose when and how to engage, that Japanese fighters could not catch it in a climb or dive, that its firepower could shred Japanese aircraft before pilots could effectively return fire. The ethical weight of this deception pressed on Sakai more heavily with each passing day. He was a combat veteran, an ace who had survived years of aerial warfare through skill and instinct. He understood that war required deception, that morale mattered, that soldiers needed confidence to fight effectively. But there existed a difference between tactical deception and sending men to die while knowing their training and equipment were inadequate for the battles they would face. That evening, he had received a letter from a former squadron mate, now stationed in the Marshall Islands. The letter, heavily censored but still revealing between the lines, described mounting losses to American fighters that seemed to grow more numerous and capable with each passing month. His friend wrote carefully about maintaining fighting spirit despite difficult circumstances, but Sakai could read the desperation in those measured phrases. They were losing not just battles but entire air groups, experienced pilots being killed faster than Japan could train replacements. Sakai thought about the 40 young pilots he had briefed that afternoon. In 6 months, perhaps a year, most of them would be dead. They would die believing they had been given honest information, trusting that their superiors had prepared them adequately for what they would face. Some would die, quickly, shot down, before understanding what happened. Others would survive long enough to realize they had been deceived, spending their final moments knowing that their leaders had sent them into battle with lies instead of truth. He could refuse to participate further in the propaganda program, could request transfer back to combat duty, where at least his death would be honest rather than complicit in deceiving others. But such refusal would accomplish nothing except his own court-martial and execution. The propaganda would continue without him, delivered by someone else who might not even understand they were lying. At least his involvement ensured that some useful information reached trainees, even if wrapped in required deceptions. Sakai touched the Lightning's cold aluminum skin one final time before leaving the hangar. He had become something he never imagined when he joined the Navy, a collaborator in his own nation's self-destruction. June 20th, 1944. Nearly a year had passed since the P-38 Lightning's capture when news reached Yokosuka that confirmed everything the technical evaluation had predicted. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had ended in catastrophic defeat for Japanese naval aviation. In what American pilots were already calling the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japanese air groups had been decimated by American fighters that included not only Lightnings but also the newer F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs. Over 600 Japanese aircraft destroyed against minimal American losses. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto read the preliminary battle reports in stunned silence, though he realized his reaction was not surprise, but rather the grim satisfaction of predictions proven accurate. Every disadvantage they had identified in the Lightning evaluation had manifested in combat. Japanese fighters could not match American speed or climb rate. Japanese pilots, many of them inadequately trained replacements for veterans lost earlier in the war, could not compensate for technological disadvantages through skill alone. American industrial capacity had produced an armada that Japan simply could not contest. Captain Genda summoned Yamamoto to his office that afternoon, looking older than his years as he gestured toward classified dispatches scattered across his desk. The naval leadership was demanding explanations for the defeat, searching for tactical failures or command mistakes that could account for losses so overwhelming they seemed impossible. But Genda knew the truth. This was not a tactical failure, but rather the inevitable outcome of fighting a technologically and industrially superior enemy with inadequate resources and increasingly desperate personnel. They discussed whether to remind senior leadership of their previous reports, the detailed analyses that had predicted precisely this kind of outcome. But both men understood such reminders would be unwelcome. The military command structure had invested too heavily in narratives of spiritual superiority and inevitable victory to acknowledge that junior officers had correctly assessed the situation a year earlier. Admitting that the lightning evaluation had been prophetic would require admitting that a year of subsequent warfare had been futile. Lieutenant Sakai arrived at the arsenal 2 days later, returning from a brief assignment at a training facility. He had heard rumors about the Philippine Sea disaster, but had not seen official casualty figures. When Yamamoto shared the numbers, Sakai sat down heavily, his single eye closing as he processed the magnitude of the losses. He asked quietly about specific air groups, units where he had served, squadrons led by men he had trained with and fought alongside. Most had been effectively destroyed. The 3 officers stood at the hangar window, looking at the P-38 Lightning that had taught them so much. Nearly a year of studying this single aircraft, understanding its implications, trying to communicate those implications to leadership that refused to listen. Now the battlefield had delivered lessons that could not be ignored, written in the lives of hundreds of pilots who had died fighting aircraft they could not match with training they had not received in time to matter. The war was lost. Everyone at Yokosuka, who understood aviation technology, knew it now. The summer of 1944 brought a strange atmosphere to Yokosuka Naval Air Arsenal. Officers and engineers went through their duties with mechanical precision, maintaining the routines of military discipline while privately acknowledging realities that official policy refused to address. The P-38 Lightning remained in its hangar, no longer an active evaluation project but retained as a reference for ongoing intelligence work. Its presence had become almost symbolic, a silent witness to truths that could not be spoken aloud. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto found himself having increasingly frank conversations with colleagues who had abandoned pretense about the war's trajectory. These discussions occurred in carefully chosen locations, during walks along the shoreline or in private residences where listening devices were unlikely. The participants varied but typically included Chief Engineer Tanaka, Lieutenant Sakai, and a rotating group of younger officers who had worked on various technical projects and reached similar conclusions about Japan's prospects. They spoke about what defeat would mean, a topic so dangerous that even thinking about it constituted thought crime, according to military law. Would American occupation be brutal or relatively benign? Would Japan's industrial base be destroyed entirely or allowed to recover? Would the emperor system survive, or would Americans impose their own governmental structures? These questions had no answers, only speculation, informed by studying American culture through the lens of captured equipment and intelligence reports. Tanaka, whose age and experience gave him certain privileges that younger officers lacked, spoke most openly about his fears and hopes. He worried about the physical destruction that Japan would endure before surrender finally came. American bombing raids were intensifying, and the industrial facilities that had struggled to compete with American production would be systematically destroyed. But he also expressed tentative hope that defeat might force Japan to abandon the militaristic philosophy that had led to this disaster, allowing the nation to rebuild along more pragmatic lines. Sakai described conversations with pilots at forward bases, Careful discussions where combat veterans shared observations that contradicted official narratives. They spoke about American pilots, who had become significantly more skilled as the war progressed, benefiting from extended training programs that Japan could no longer afford. They described the overwhelming numerical superiority that American forces enjoyed, with replacement aircraft and pilots arriving faster than Japanese forces could inflict losses. The pilots knew they were losing but continued fighting because military culture offered no alternative to death in battle. One evening in late August, the group gathered at Tanaka's apartment to discuss an unthinkable question posed by Lieutenant Kobayashi. Should they attempt to preserve technical documentation and personnel records that might be valuable during reconstruction after the war? The suggestion carried enormous risk. If discovered, such preparation for defeat would be treated as treason. But it also represented a last gesture of responsibility toward the nation they served, even as its military leadership drove toward catastrophic conclusion. They made no firm decisions that evening, but the conversation itself marked how far they had traveled from the certainties that had defined their early military careers. October 15, 1944, Admiral Ozawa requested a comprehensive update on all technical intelligence gathered since the P-38 Lightning's capture 16 months earlier. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto was given 2 weeks to compile the report, with instructions to provide honest assessment regardless of how politically uncomfortable the conclusions might be. The Admiral's request was unusual enough to suggest that senior leadership was finally willing to confront realities they had previously ignored. Yamamoto worked with obsessive dedication, pulling together data from multiple sources. The Lightning evaluation formed the foundation, but he incorporated intelligence from other captured American equipment, interrogations of prisoners, and analysis of combat engagement reports. He included production estimates, updated with the latest information, casualty statistics that showed the accelerating attrition of Japanese air groups, and technical comparisons demonstrating the widening gap between Japanese and American aircraft capabilities. The report's central conclusion was stated with careful but unmistakable clarity. Japan had lost the air war and lacked the industrial capacity to regain parity. American aircraft production had continued accelerating, while Japanese output declined due to resource shortages and bombing damage to manufacturing facilities. The qualitative advantage that American designs possessed had been magnified by quantitative superiority that made Japanese resistance increasingly futile. Yamamoto devoted an entire section to the strategic implications of the Lightning evaluation. The aircraft had revealed American industrial philosophy a year before that philosophy manifested in overwhelming battlefield superiority. The emphasis on pilot protection, technological sophistication, and robust construction had all proven their worth in combat. Japanese design principles, emphasizing weight reduction and maneuverability, had been rendered obsolete by American tactics that exploited speed and firepower advantages. He submitted the report on October 28, delivering it personally to Admiral Ozawa's office. The Admiral accepted the thick folder without comment, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. Yamamoto knew that Ozawa understood the implications, had known them since the original Lightning briefing over a year ago. This report would either provide ammunition for officers seeking to open peace negotiations, or it would be filed away and forgotten while the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion. 3 days later, Yamamoto received a brief note from the Admiral's office. The report had been forwarded to a restricted distribution list that included several members of the Supreme War Council. No other information was provided, no indication of whether anyone would act on the analysis. Yamamoto understood that his role was complete. He had documented the truth as thoroughly as possible. What happened next was beyond his authority or control. Captain Genda called Yamamoto to his office that afternoon and spoke with unusual openness. Regardless of whether the report influenced policy, it would serve as a historical record of what some officers had understood about the war's trajectory. Future generations studying this period would find evidence that not everyone had been blind to reality, that some had tried to speak truth even when that truth was unwelcome. It was a small comfort, but perhaps the only one available to men in their position. August 17, 1945. 2 days after Emperor Hirohito's radio broadcast announcing Japan's surrender, Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto stood in the Yokosuka hangar where the P-38 Lightning had resided for nearly 2 years. American occupation forces would arrive within days, and he had been assigned to prepare documentation of all captured equipment and technical intelligence for transfer to the victors. The irony was not lost on him that he would hand back to Americans the aircraft, whose evaluation had taught him that Japan could not win the war. The Lightning appeared unchanged despite the chaos surrounding it. While Japanese cities burned and military units disbanded in confusion, this American fighter remained a testament to the industrial and technological superiority that had determined the war's outcome. Yamamoto walked around it one final time, remembering the moment he had first seen its components unpacked from wooden crates in New Guinea's jungle. He had suspected then that this aircraft represented something significant. He had not imagined how completely it would reshape his understanding of the conflict. Captain Genda arrived as Yamamoto was cataloging technical documents. The captain looked exhausted, aged by years beyond the 2 that had actually passed since the Lightning's capture. They discussed practical matters of documentation and transfer procedures, but eventually their conversation turned to the question that haunted them both. Had their reports made any difference? Had anyone in authority actually read and understood what they had tried to communicate? Genda believed their work had reached some senior officers who might have supported peace negotiations earlier if they had possessed political power to act on their convictions. But the military leadership had been dominated by officers who interpreted any suggestion of negotiation as defeatism, who believed that spiritual determination could overcome material disadvantages, who preferred national suicide to the humiliation of surrender. The technical truth that Yamamoto and others had documented could not compete with ideology that had hardened into religious faith. Lieutenant Sakai joined them in the hangar, his last visit before departing for his home prefecture. The 3 men stood together in silence, contemplating the aircraft that had taught them so much. Sakai spoke quietly about the young pilots he had trained, knowing that many had died in battles they could not win, flying aircraft that could not compete. He wondered if honest assessment of Japanese capabilities might have saved some of those lives through earlier surrender, or whether the same leadership that ignored technical reports would have simply ordered everyone to fight to the death regardless. Yamamoto thought about the network of officers who had understood the war was lost long before official surrender. They had continued serving, continued performing their duties, unable to act on their knowledge but unable to unknow what they had learned. The P-38 Lightning had been their teacher, an enemy machine that revealed uncomfortable truths through aluminum and engineering. Those truths had arrived too late to change the war's trajectory, but perhaps not too late to inform how Japan would approach its future. Understanding why they had lost might prevent future generations from repeating the same catastrophic mistakes.